Welcome to supply and demand. Supply-demand analysis, demand-supply analysis, however you hear it. It's one of the kind of the cornerstones of economics in general. And for microeconomics, I would say it is the cornerstone model that you'll have to know. We spend a lot of time on the initial demand and supply work, but in terms of the importance in understanding microeconomics, it is absolutely crucial. This is the section you must know. The good thing is once you start to go through it, a lot of it is just common sense, but you've got to kind of remember these various common sense items and how once you have three different things changing or two different things changing, how does that affect everything? It is used, so in this course, we'll be using an initial look at supply and demand with some interesting questions. Then also we'll be looking at what happens if you restrict demand and supply. How efficient is demand and supply analysis, or a better way to phrase that is how good are markets? How efficient is a market if left unrestricted or if you restrict it? Later in the course, as far as how we use supply and demand, the firm behavior, right? We'll be looking at what is the demand for a firm's products and how does it change based on what type of market they're in. We'll be looking at demand and supply later to see, when might we see discrimination in a market? All sorts of things you may not have thought economic analysis applies, could be applied to. Demand and supply can give you some really great insights. So a lot of people might, economics is thought of as sometimes as the dismal science. Demand and supply, maybe the initial building blocks aren't the most fun, but you can really do a lot of stuff with these tools. It's really good stuff. So to set this up, when we're looking at our demand and supply, what we'll eventually be looking at is a market, right? Market behavior that's not restricted. The foundation for the way we think about this really comes from Adam Smith. So Adam Smith, he's famous for writing The Wealth of Nations in 1776. What he used to think was fascinating was that back in colonial markets, and obviously none of us have been alive in 1776 markets, so we don't know exactly what they look like, but I kind of imagine something like a farmer's market, right? What Adam Smith thought was fascinating was that you'd have these big markets, all sorts of people would come in to sell their products, all sorts of people would come in to buy products. At the end of the day, the sellers never left with extra products available, right? They sold what they needed to sell. Well, if you just think about that for a second, if you always are selling if you see that the people selling always are selling what they need to sell, you would think what that means is some of the time buyers are getting what they want, but some of the time some buyers don't get enough of the product, right? The sellers are always selling their stuff. You're going to have different numbers of sellers showing up on different days, bringing different numbers of products. So some days there will be a lot, some days there will be a little. Sellers always sell it all. What you would think that would mean, first glance maybe, is that buyers sometimes don't get enough of the product. Now, what Adam Smith thought was fascinating was the fact that that didn't happen either. Sellers never left the day with excess products, but at the end of the day, buyers got what they wanted. Buyers weren't leaving, I wish I could have bought more of this product. They weren't saying that. This is what really helped Adam Smith kind of get this mental framework and thinking, wow, this is amazing that this happens, is what helped get the foundation for the demand and supply analysis that we'll be starting today. He has the famous invisible hand quote. That's Adam Smith. He said that in a market system, people, they act as if they're being pushed by an invisible hand to promote the well-being of society. It's one of the more famous quotes within economics. So the visible hand to promote the well-being of society, that's Adam Smith. A couple of the questions, or the big question we look at in this lesson, how does that happen, right? How can markets for products always seem to have approximately the correct quantity available? And while we start this, I'll ask you to think, how often do you see shortages of products? Right? How often in your daily life is there a shortage of a product? I'm guessing if you've come up with any examples, it's not things that are that commonly purchased, right? How often have you gone to the grocery store and haven't been able to get that product you really wanted to buy? You know, the things I can think of are all almost related to novelty items, or not novelty items, but toys around the holiday season, right? You know, the Nintendo Wii, when it first came out, there were shortages of that. Same with the PlayStation 3. Every year there might be a new Tickle Me Elmo style doll that there's a run on. But you have to think pretty hard to think of when there's shortages. Why does that happen? Demand and supply helps us answer this question. So it's a really good section. It's good stuff, and we're gonna dive right in just a moment. To preface this, you will be using this in the course. This is absolutely crucial. If you're struggling on this, make sure you come get my help right away. Right, I don't mind going through extra problems, working with you in whatever way we need to do it. But it is crucial you get this, right? This is, if you don't have this, the rest of the course is going to be a mess as well. So it is crucial, but it's also useful, right? You'll use it in this course. Like, I mean, it's going to be on the test. You know, there'll be test questions, right? You have to know this just to get through the class. But beyond that, right, demand and supply explain a number of phenomena. It's a really, really useful tool. Okay, so we have demand and supply, right? We're going to start looking at the demand side. So what do we mean by demand? Well, we start with what we say quantity demanded. It's the number of units a consumer's willing and able to buy in your little set time period, given a specific price. So if you give a price, consumer gives you a quantity demanded. Now, what we call a demand schedule is when you provide many different prices, and the consumer will have some different level of quantity demanded at each price. When you put this in a chart format, that's called a demand schedule, right? You may want to buy a different number of slices of pizza if the price is $3 versus if the price is $2, $1, or if they're free, right? You'd have different quantity demanded at those prices, perhaps. If you wrote out a little chart that shows what would be your quantity demanded of pizza at $3, what would be your quantity demanded of pizza at $2, what would be your quantity demanded at $1, and what would be your quantity demanded if that pizza is free, that little chart would be called the demand schedule. So the demand schedule, table or chart format, shows the relationship between the price of a good and the quantity demanded. So we've got an example here. We've got somebody named Helen who likes lattes, right? So at different prices, Helen has different demand for latte. Remember, this is within a given time period, so maybe we'll say it's within a week, right? In a given week, at these various prices, this is how many lattes Helen would demand. What we could see up at the very top, if they're free, Helen wants 16 in a week. If they're $1, it drops a bit. She'll only want 14 now. If it's $2, it drops to 12. At $3, she'd want 10 in a week. $4, $8, $5, $6. And if it's $6, she'd only want 4. So that's a demand schedule. The demand schedule, right, at each one of these points is a quantity demanded, right? When we go back to the definition of quantity demanded, it's the number of units a consumer is willing and able to buy given a specific price. So at $3, the quantity demanded is 10. At $5, the quantity demanded is 6. You put that all together, it's a demand schedule. So both the demand schedule and the quantity demanded, it could be for one person, like what we just had for Helen. Or it could be for a group of consumers, right? Once we get going and we kind of understand these concepts, most of the time we'll be referring to a group of consumers. We'll be looking at, often I like to use the market for, look at Domino's Pizza, right? Kind of conceptualize. Most people have some good idea of how Domino's might work. We would think of all the consumers who would buy from Domino's. But you can do it for just one, and there are times in the class that we'll do it for just one, especially as we set up how to go about thinking about the demand curve. Okay. So we have what's called the law of demand. The law of demand indicates as price goes up, the quantity drops, or vice versa. As the price drops, the quantity increases. Now, when we talk about this, we're talking about the quantity one is willing to purchase. So as price increases, the quantity demanded falls, or as price decreases, the quantity demanded increases. Law of demand, this is one of the, from time to time we'll have these various laws that we've mentioned. This is one that I hope makes a lot of sense, right? As the price drops, a consumer would want to buy more, or as the price increases, the consumer would want to buy less. Should be straightforward, but this is in fact known as the law of demand within economics. Okay, the demand curve. Most of the time when we represent demand in this class, we'll be representing it through the demand curve. What the demand curve is, it's just the demand schedule, but we put it on a graph. Right? We're using a graph instead of simply, instead of the chart or the table format. So for this, what do we assume when we're putting this graph together? We're assuming that the consumer has the choice over how many to buy, but that price is fixed outside of the consumer's control. So this is an assumption that we'll make. Price is exogenous is the term for this. But this fits along with the idea of how did we think about the demand schedule, right? We thought about the quantity demanded and the fact that you tell the consumer a price, they would tell you how much of the product they'd buy, right? Well, here it is. You tell the consumer a price. On the demand curve, you put in the price given to the consumer. The consumer says, oh, it's $3, I'll buy 10 lattes, right? Price is fixed outside the consumer's control, but consumer gets to choose the quantity he or she would buy at any given price. So if price changes, what we'll end up doing is going from one spot on our curve to another spot on the curve. So let's start translate. Here's the demand schedule we had for lattes before, but now we're going to also put this in a curve format. So key thing when we're drawing our demand curves, quantity goes on the x-axis, and like all the notes, you should be putting this demand curve in your notes, right? Quantity goes on the x-axis, quantity of lattes. Price goes on the y-axis. That is always going to hold. We're always going to have quantity on the x-axis, price on the y-axis. Now, here it's given for you. If you're doing this from scratch, one of the first things you need to do is figure out how far, what kind of number coordinates do we want on each axis, right? Well, the quantity demanded, you're going to start at 0, but the highest point is 16. So you could see that's right about here on the graph. And for price, start at 0, goes up to 6. We're good with that as well. So what we end up seeing here is going from $0 to $6, 0 to 16 units, and you can start plotting points in. So at 0, 16 units, quantity of latte demanded is 16, right? Helen wants 16 lattes if it's free. If it's $1, she wants 14. If it's $2, she wants 12. If it's $3, she wants to buy 10 units. $4, she wants to buy 8 units. And in your notes, when you're doing this, you should be plotting these points along here, right? You should be going $4, finding the point where it's at $4 and 8 units, and then you plot the point right up here. $5, she would have 6 units, right? $5, 6 units, and you plot the point. Finally, $6, it's the highest price point we have on our schedule. Oops, let me go back. There we go. $6 is the highest price point that we have. At $6, Helen demands 4 units. This is our demand curve. In your notes, when you plot out a demand curve also, and when we do some on the board later, I'll be showing this as well, but you should put a D next to the demand curve. Plot the demand curve, put a D next to it. It just helps keep it sorted when you put in a demand. Later we'll be putting a supply curve in. As you might guess, we label the supply curve with an S. So this is the demand curve. All the exact same information is on the curve as in the chart. It's just the curve is graphically represented. Now, what we just looked at was a demand curve for Helen only, right? This is Helen's demand schedule and demand curve. As mentioned, we could look at the market demand, and all you do is take the sum of the quantities demanded at each price and add it together. So here, as a very simple example, suppose you just have two people, only Helen and Ken, who are the only two buyers in the latte market. So at the various prices, we know what Helen's demand schedule was. Here's Ken's demand schedule. So then you get a market quantity demanded, right? If they're free, Helen wants 16 lattes, Ken wants 8. At $1, Helen wants 14, Ken wants 7. So we get 16 plus 8 is 24, 14 plus 7 is 21. Price of $2, 18 total, all the way down. Right, it's just the sum. And if you have 100 people, it's done the exact same way, right? 100 people, they'll at a price of $1. Helen wants 14, Ken wants 7, and the other 98 people want however many lattes they want. And that is the market quantity demanded if the price is $1. So it's all the same, just kind of the construction of this. I think this is relatively straightforward, right? The market demand is the sum of the individual demand for all consumers. But it does relate, right? This market demand that will be coming doesn't come out of thin air. It is based on the demand you see for individuals. So we have the demands by looking at the market, right? The market quantity demanded versus the price. That's a demand schedule, right? Price, quantity demanded for the market, put in a chart or table format. That's a demand schedule, which means we could graph that on a demand curve. So the market demand curve for latte in our little two-person only world looks like this. Once again, quantity on the x-axis, price on the y-axis, demand curve. Just plot each individual point out, and you've got it. So with these demand curves, do they satisfy the law of demand, right? We said that we've got this law of demand. Law of demand. As price increases, the quantity one is willing to purchase decreases. We say it's a law, so really, because we say it's a law, it better hold. So what do we have here? Well, for Helen's individual schedule, as the price increases, the quantity of lattes Helen wants drops. Makes a lot of sense, satisfies our law of demand. Because the law of demand holds, what we expect for our demand curves is that they will be downward sloping. As you drop the price, the quantity demanded will fall. So price goes from 6 to 5, as you drop the price, the quantity demanded increases, right? Drop from 6 to 5, the quantity goes from 4 to 6. So as the quantity is increasing, the price is dropping, or as the price is increasing, the quantity is dropping. The demand curve is sloped downward. So as long as the law of demand holds, our demand curves will be downward sloping. As the price drops, we'll see a higher quantity, or as the price increases, we'll see a lower quantity. We saw that with Helen's individual demand curve. And for the market demand curve, we see the same thing. As the price drops, the quantity demanded increases. A quick technical point here. When the price changes, does demand change? The answer to this is no. Demand represents the entire demand curve, or an entire demand schedule, right? Demand schedule is just the same as the demand curve, only the demand curve is the graph, the demand schedule is the chart. When the price changes, it doesn't affect the curve itself. So we'd say demand does not change. What does change is the quantity demanded. So going back to the graph we just had up, if the price goes from $5 to $3, the demand doesn't change. Demand is this entire curve, right? We're going to, in your notes, you should label a D next to this for demand. That entire curve doesn't change, which means demand doesn't change. What does change, if you go from 3 to 5, the quantity demanded goes from 15 to 9. So if the price changes, we don't say that demand changes. What we would say is the quantity that's demanded changes. And it might seem like this is nitpicky, but the demand curve has the quantity demanded for all various prices. If we don't differentiate this, we run into some issues once we throw the supply curve in there as well. So it is important, even though this might seem like it's a kind of a nitpicking point, when the price changes, the quantity demanded changes, not the demand curve itself. Now, the demand curve itself can change. So the demand curve itself, if something other than price is affecting demand, then the demand curve itself changes. And what you would see is demand changes by shifting to the left or to the right. This is a decrease in demand or an increase in demand. We would call this a change in demand, right? If it's just the price, it's not a change in demand. But if something other than price affects demand, then you see the demand curve itself will change. So what else can affect demand? A lot of things, right? Income is one of them. If you make more money, do you think you'll buy more of a product? Often, many of you probably will nod, yeah, if I make more money, I'll buy more of a product. Well, for a lot of products, that's probably true. But, so the products that it's true of we'll call normal. But there are probably some products that this is not the case. And these are called inferior products. So I'd ask you to think, is there anything you buy now that once you start to make more money, you won't buy anymore? Right? Are there any products you buy now that once you start to make more money, you won't buy anymore? Two most common things that I get is two most common responses I hear are ramen noodles. Right? Ramen is really cheap. So because it's really cheap, it's popular among college students. Second one was like generic brands or cheaper versions of a product. If you are of legal age and you're buying beer, if you're in college still, you may be buying the least expensive beer that's available. Once you get out of college, start to make a little bit more money, though, you might stop buying cheap beer, not buy cheap beer as often. If so, then you'd say that cheap beer is an inferior good, or ramen noodles are an inferior good. As your income went up, you bought fewer of them. Most goods, though, are normal goods. As you make more money, you'd buy more of the product, or at least you wouldn't drop your consumption of the various products. So those are what we call normal products. What else affects demand? Well, the number of buyers, right? The more people who are willing to buy, might consider buying a product, the greater the demand. It's relatively straightforward, but certainly has a big impact. If you are, once again, let's go to Domino's. The demand for Domino's pizza changes dramatically between when school is in session, or when Susquehanna University is in session, and when it's not in session. When Susquehanna University is not in session, that's far fewer people who might be willing to buy Domino's pizza, right? Demand drops dramatically. Tastes and preferences, right? There are various fads for products. Things go in and out of style. Tastes and preferences matter. Expectations for the future can matter. Prices for related goods can also matter. So for prices for related goods, let's think through, there's a couple ways this could matter. One is if the products are substitutes. What do we mean by substitutes? Well, the two products could substitute for each other. For video game systems, like the Wii U versus a PlayStation 3, or versus an Xbox 360. Those products all kind of do the same thing. They're substitutes. For food products, right? Maybe water versus soda versus beer, or hamburgers and hot dogs might be substitutes, right? Anytime you consider one product or another product, products are substitutes. Various, the fast food restaurants all serve stuff that's kind of substitutable, right? You could go to McDonald's for your supper, or you could go to Taco Bell, right? The products are substitutes. Well, if a related good price changes and it's a substitute, if the price of the substitutable product decreases, say demand shifts to the left. So this is a decrease in demand. So with the decrease in the price of a substitutable product, demand shifts to the left. Let's say you are looking at a video game system and you're thinking, well, I think I'm going to buy the PlayStation 3. Well, if a week before you're about to buy the PlayStation 3, the Xbox 360 drops dramatically in price, you might reconsider, right? With the decrease in the price of a substitutable product, your demand for the PlayStation 3 may have dropped. So demand curve, we would say it would shift to the left. That a shift to the left shows a decrease in the demand for a product. For complements, with the decrease in the price of a complementary product, demand shifts to the right. If you like, let's say you make games, video games for the PlayStation 3. Well, that's clearly a complement for the video game system, right? It goes together with the system. Peanut butter and jelly, those are complements, right? They often go together. Well, if the price of peanut butter drops dramatically, you might see people buy more peanut butter, right? We would expect people to buy more peanut butter based on our law of demand. But because peanut butter goes with jelly, we would also expect people to buy more jelly as well. So if the price of a complementary product drops, your demand would increase. If the price of peanut butter drops, the demand for jelly will increase. And if it increases, the shift is to the right. If demand decreases, the shift is to the left. So for an increase in demand, we're just going to show what would happen here. At every single price, people would demand more of the product. So we would have an entirely new demand curve that has been shifted to the right? The demand at $6, the quantity demanded used to be 6. Now it's up to, let's see here, price of 6. Doesn't really show, but it's at about 11, right? Doesn't show it the new one exactly. It doesn't have the dotted line now, but it looks like it's about 11. When the price was 5, it used to be 9. Now it is, it's at about 14. Yeah, it says over here by 5 in the example, and it does seem to match up. At any given price, the new quantity demanded is higher. So when would this happen? Well, if you get more income in the product as a normal good, as we said, your demand would shift this way. If the price of a complementary product drops, it would shift this way. If there's more buyers in the market, the demand would shift this way. The other way that demand could shift is a decrease in demand, and that's just the opposite effect, right? You just move the other direction. You would have a shift, and it would go to the left instead. So when you have a shift in demand, the entire demand curve changes. It could either go to the right, as in this example, or it could go to the left. Key fact for you to keep in mind is knowing the difference between a movement along the demand curve, which is just when price changes, and a shift in the demand curve is going to be crucial. A part of it is we're about to shift over to looking at supply. Once we shift over to looking at supply, you have to know when one curve is affected versus the other curve being affected. When is there a movement in one curve versus a shift in the other, or shift in one, movement in the other? You have to start to learn how the terms for shift versus movement. Otherwise, it gets a little bit messy once you start to throw both the demand and the supply curve in on the same graph, which we will be doing pretty shortly.